For those of you who are not local, I should mention that Prince Edward County is just about an hour west of Kingston, so it is one of the most local rural economies that we can point to as an example in this area, and it is booming in terms of the creative economy. Dan, you see Dan Taylor repeatedly referred to, sitting right there if you want to hear more, and Craig Desjardins, who helped open the event today. He's an economic developer and in charge of the CFTC in that area as well. If you want more information, the next two presentations may also refer to that, and then after lunch we will move entirely away from the local area.
Okay.
Greg Spencer.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you and Monieson Centre for having me back again. I was here earlier this year to give part of a talk along with Dan. I also very much like the program and the way it's put together. I think there are a lot of complementary pieces to it. And I mention that because I think what I'm going to be talking about is slightly different, but also fits in quite well with a lot of the topics. What I'm essentially going to be talking about is the creative process itself and why place matters to the actual creative process. So instead of talking about specific, say, occupations or specific industries, I'm talking about how new knowledge actually comes to be. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow right now. I do have a history in economic development as a practitioner. I worked in London, in the UK, but all around England, and a lot in rural areas as well. Back then it was the knowledge economy, it wasn't the creative economy, but a lot of very similar issues, but also related issues around things like the aging population, which is a particularly acute problem in rural areas, but also problems of infrastructure, which I'm sure we'll be hearing more about later in terms of broadband access. Also important for delivering services for local governments electronically and so on and so forth. So we work with Cable and Wireless and the British Telecom as well as the government to address some of those issues. I came back to do a PhD and I was interested in these knowledge economy sort of issues, and there was already a lot of research going on at U of T, but mainly around cities. So a lot of my research has started in urban contexts, but it does apply equally to rural areas, but sort of in a mirror sort of way, and I'll explain that. So the way I often sort of start off conceptualizing the geography of the creative process and the geography of learning is the idea of the connection of these three basic things. So what we know, the knowledge that we have, is a lot to do with who we know, who we tend to interact with. And who we interact with has a lot to do with where we are. Because even though we have, a lot of technology allows us to, communicate with people who aren't directly in front of us, often that technology just reinforces existing sort of face-to-face communication. So where we are has a lot to do with who we know, and who we know has a lot to do with what we know. But of course there's a lot of things that go on in between these, and particularly important in terms of what I'm going to be concluding with, is that there is an impact of changing technologies in terms of that relationship between where we are and who we know. So it's often, it's also a moving target. These things are evolving. They're not one-to-one relationships. And trying to understand how these things connect with one another is very important in terms of the geography of the creative process itself. Another key thing that I also like to outline is that the creative process, in the way that I conceive it as well as a group of other academics, is that creativity is just simply one type of knowledge production. It's not necessarily the same thing as, say, scientific discovery or technological innovation, but creativity, sort of in a purer sense, is more sort of to do with subjective kinds of knowledge, heuristics, as opposed to things that are more scientifically based, more sort of universal type knowledge. These are, sort of some of the terms and cultures, terms and, that are associated with different types of knowledge, different types of learning. And what's important to this is that if they are slightly different social processes, they're not completely different from one another, and there's not, you know, one pure end in reality and one pure end in the other. But if there are different, slightly different social processes, then perhaps the social environments matter differently to different types of knowledge production. And so if different environments matter differently to each of these, then perhaps there is a geography to these kinds of knowledge production processes as well. What I've done in terms of trying to connect sort of the idea of creativity more to the creative process itself to a lot of the more common literature that we may be more familiar with around creative cities, creative industries, creative workers, is to go to the sociology or the psychology literature on creativity in terms of, you know, what it is, but also why, you know, some people maybe exhibit more creative behavior than others. You know, the psychologists have a much longer history, I think, of looking at creativity than, say, you know, economic geographers, at least in a very particular and specific sense. And the literature looks at it in sort of two basic ways, nature versus nurture. Some people would say, you know, there's something, you know, some sort of brain chemicals that, you know, make people just more predisposed to being more open-minded or more creative. They have to make new connections. But what's more interesting for the kinds of things we're talking about is that, you know, there's a nurture side, obviously, to it. And so people's, you know, personal histories, their development, their learning, right from childhood has a lot to do with why some people may be more creative than others. But where it gets really interesting, I think, is in the social psychology side of things. Understanding that creativity isn't just about individuals that have particular traits. It really is about the wider environment that people are in. And this is really crucial for understanding why creativity might happen in some places more than others. And a lot of the work that goes on, the research that happens in this area, has to do with actually looking at firms and the structures of firms, or actually looking at work groups, so small groups of people, understanding why teams of people may be more creative or produce more creativity than others. And a lot of that research has to do with, you know, who is in particular groups, particularly around, you know, are those groups, you know, diverse, or are they homogeneous in the character of the individuals? And showing, you know, how important it is that, you know, the importance of diversity in terms of, you know, preventing groupthink from happening, but also the idea that creativity comes from difference colliding, basically, and new ideas coming together. Of course, there's a downside to diversity in terms of communication. People who know different things or come from different backgrounds sometimes have a hard time talking to one another. And so we think about it in terms of sort of an optimal level of sort of this cognitive distance, or an optimal level of diversity. Another important aspect of that research is not just how novelty happens, but how, you know, once novelty is produced, how it is accepted by others. And so, you know, creativity doesn't really occur just because something new has happened. It has to also be valuable and useful in some way. And that's evaluated, you know, collectively. It's not just somebody can say, come along and say, this is great, and declare it creative. It has to be trickled into society in some way. And so that also is important from a geographic point of view in terms of, you know, producer and consumer kinds of relationships. So that obviously happens, that kind of research often happens at a sort of smaller firm level scale, but we can think about this in terms of entire places as well, in terms of whether places are diverse or whether they're homogeneous, and how much that, you know, has an impact on how much creativity happens locally. One of the things that I've done is create a model of the creative process that happens over space and time. I know some of the people in the audience, I think, have seen this already. I'm just going to give you the very, very cut-down version. I presented this to my class, my students, on Monday, and it took two full hours. So I'll try and give you the 3-minute version. Basically, it's a computer simulation that looks at sort of human behavior, and particularly how people tend to relate to one another, who tends to interact with who, how learning takes place between people, and then how that learned knowledge is turned into sort of creative output. So how do people make new knowledge from what they already know? And also it includes, space and time. It's an evolutionary model. People move around, they interact with different people, they trade knowledge. And this shows the evolution of place, but also of knowledge on a collective level, but also on an individual level. So these are the things that the individuals in this computer simulation do. It's just like The Sims or SimCity, if you've ever seen those popular games on computers. But this is sort of the very nerdy academic version of that. So basically, this is just sort of a graphic representation of the kinds of things that tend to happen. It's all based on probabilities that change and evolve as actions happen in the model. So we start off with 10 places, each with a local culture unto themselves, 25 individuals in each place. They all know the exact same thing in each place, but it's different between different places. And what happens is the model starts to evolve in terms of interaction. So pairs of agents will interact depending on different probabilities and different reasons. Space, location having a big part to do with it, but also cognitive distance having a lot to do with it as well. So how similar you are increases the probability of you interacting. So interaction starts to occur, they start to learn from one another, they start to diversify their own individual knowledge sets. They also start to move around based on opportunities, but also on their own, personal sort of kinship connections. And obviously, things start to get a little bit more mixed up. And as the model evolves, what tends to happen is that you tend to get, sort of a dominant place, a few second-tier places, and then some more sort of peripheral places. And the patterns that we tend to see happening over and over again is that more creativity tends to happen in the largest diverse places because there are more learning opportunities to bridge different kinds of knowledge, which facilitates the creative process. So what we see here, the bigger the size gets, the more those people have learned. The squares are of the people that actually managed to make new knowledge during this time period. Basically, the circles were the ones that didn't. Basically, the squares would have put two different colors together to make a brand new kind of knowledge, essentially. Again, that's the very brief lesson. But the point is that, there is an advantage to having scale, but also diversity. And the flip side, which is important, what we're talking about in terms of rural places, is that smaller homogeneous places are at a creative disadvantage because they don't have those same kinds of connections, or they struggle to have those same kinds of connections, those same learning opportunities, which is a key part of the creative process. We've looked at mapping these sorts of industries that rely on, say, creativity, innovation, discovery. We find a very strong correlation between diversity and the location of creative industries as we've defined them here. Very concentrated in, location quotient of 140 cities, only 12 of them are over 1. So you can just imagine just how concentrated those industries are. But also looked at individual social network characteristics, so of actual people, and found that individuals working in creative industries and occupations have the largest personal social networks, the most diverse personal social networks, and the most dynamic social networks in terms of making new connections at a rapid pace. So what we can gather from that is that there really is an importance for people working in sort of creative fields to have those opportunities to create those sorts of networks that they need in order to do their jobs.